Ahead and get started. I'm sure a few more folks may wander in, but I think we have an exciting talk, so it'd be good to get going. I'm Gunnar Knapp. I'm the director of ICER. I'd like to welcome you all here. This is our speaker, Betsy Baker, and I'll let her tell you more about herself. But first, I thought that it would be useful for all of us if we went briefly around the room and just gave people a chance to introduce themselves and say briefly who you are and who you're with, just so that we know who all's here. Some of you are new faces to me, and probably all of us are new faces to some of us. So, sir.
I'm Keith Steinbaugh. I'm with the Department of Defense. I'm up on JP here. I'm the Arctic Issues lead for the Alaska Mission Operations Center. So I've been trying to get more involved in a lot of Arctic issues the last few years.
Welcome.
Thanks.
Nancy Hemsath. I'm a consultant formerly with the Institute of the North.
James Shoemake. I'm a new research professional here at ICER. I work with spatial analysis and GIS.
Hi, Matt.
Matt Reimer, ICER economist.
Maureen Bierman, UAF adjunct and PhD student at State University.
At Michigan State? Oh.
Kevin Hilmer, PhD student at UAF of Amy Lovecraft,
right.
Studying oil and gas development on the North Slope.
Right.
Scott Goldsmith.
Hey, Scott. Yeah.
Professor of Economics and Branches.
I'm Daisy Saffer. I work with the University and statewide for UAF and Services.
Danielle Nelson. I also work for the University of Services.
Okay.
Diane Hirschberg.
Hi, Diane. Yeah, nice to see you.
Mara Kimmel, ICER researcher and graduate student.
I'm Kyle Wark. I'm the Indigenous Researcher and Policy Analyst at First Alaskans Institute.
Okay, cool.
I'm also a Master's in Anthropology student here at UAA, and I have been a research assistant here at ICER a year ago.
Great.
Katie Bender, I'm with Director Bank and Public.
Great, nice to see you. Thanks for
Parker Institute of the North, Senior Associate, U.S. Delegate for the Law of the Sea.
Carl Wassley. I'm a technical advisor to Alaska Intertribal Council.
And Gunnar Knapp, economics faculty and director here.
Great. Wow, what a nice range of. Oh, Heather.
Yes, we met too.
Yeah. Yeah, and Heather had me here a couple years ago.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's good to be back and good to have such a range of interests. I'm Betsy Baker. I'm a professor at Vermont Law School, which is a private law school. It's not part of University of Vermont, to get that straight up front. And I've been in Alaska for about 6 months, looking primarily at oil and gas regulation at the federal level on a separate project. My background on the law of the sea is that I had taught it for years and ended up going out on Healy for 2 cruises in 2008 and 2009 with the scientists who are mapping the extent of the continental shelf. And I will talk a bit about how that changed my life in very good ways. So, and then just before coming to Alaska, the first part of my research leave, I was in Ocean and Polar Affairs, which is an office in the State Department under Oceans and International Environmental Science. So spent about 10 months working on the documentation side of what we do with all this data once we collect it. So I'm going to introduce that process, and I think it's probably best just to have you ask questions as we go. And the way I'm framing it today, it relates in part to other research I'm doing, which is looking at the relationship between science and law. We all talk about science-based decision-making and trying to figure out what that really means in a concrete setting. So thank you to ICER for the invitation and to Chris for the setup, and we'll just go from here. So I think we all have images of the continental shelf. At least I like to think we do, even if it's from 6th grade or 8th grade tectonics. So think for a minute about when you hear continental shelf, what do you think about? And that's not what we want it to do. Is that what we want it to do? Sorry. We will slideshow once more and push the right button. So thinking about our images of continental shelf, if you're a political scientist, David Muss, I just looked to see what you folks here are up to in poli-sci. He was the head of a study for impacts of OCS activities on bowhead whaling. Right, so that's one direction you might go. There may well be economic studies that you guys have produced at ICER on continental shelf resources. If you are a physical oceanographer, and this is a UAF example, you might think, what's the circulation? How do the circulation patterns relate to the geophysical structures of the shelf? If you're a marine geophysicist, and this is a map I show at all of any talk I give on the Arctic because I so love it for any number of reasons. This is a collaborative effort put together by scientists from around the pole who, when they learned that under the Law of the Sea Convention, their countries would begin mapping the extent of their continental shelf, they all got together and said, folks, let's do it on a similar set of protocols, and so that we have comparable information. And so independent of the requirements under the Law of the Sea Treaty, but driven by that process, they came together and put this map together. And this is actually version 2. A version 3 just came out. The other reason I like to show this map is it really does, for me, visualize what the shelf might look like, right? These are images. This is an imagination. But it also shows just how vast the Russian continental shelf is. The light blue is the shallow shelf, some 200 meters, Lomonosov Ridge. You can see our little shelf over here off of Barrow. Doesn't go anywhere near 200 nautical miles, which is roughly there. The Arctic continental shelf is 25% of the shelf in the globe. So it's a good chunk of shelf. It's a shallow ocean. And that transition between sort of the shallow shelf down to the abyssal plain is what we're talking about when we talk about the process under the Law of the Sea Convention. And I'll return to that.
Very briefly, is that map pretty much complete and known, or are there sort of areas unexplored, and are there mountains hiding there that we don't know about, or is this basically pretty...
It's a big mystery. We've only mapped about 7% of the Arctic Ocean. So this is all speculation.
Oh, so you're saying that is not, it doesn't necessarily look like that. There may be trenches and canyons.
Oh, yeah, and each cruise that has gone out has discovered a new seamount or a new canyon. Yeah, okay. It's a great opportunity for the scientists. They don't really care about how far the shelf goes. They're just getting to collect all sorts of really interesting data, and I'll talk about that as well. But that's a helpful distinction. So if you're a lawyer and you think of the continental shelf, ta-da! This is what we think of. Words on a page, right? But it's a beautiful document, and Walt knows well the tears and sweat that went into producing it. And it is, it has 320 articles, a lot of innovations. We did not have an exclusive economic zone before this convention was negotiated. I won't go into the other things that it introduced in any detail, but really, I think, very creative arrangements for dispute settlement, an entire section on environmental protection, so many innovations in the convention. And one problem that it solved that had been plaguing international law for years is, what is the continental shelf? How far does it extend? The previous version had basically said, well, it's kind of as, if you can exploit it, if you can get that deep on the shelf, then it's shelf. But that's a very squishy, not helpful distinction. And so they finally did come up with provisions for how you measure the extent of the continental shelf. And I'll provide a bit more detail on that as well. This is the definition. So the continental shelf comprises the seabed and the subsoil of submarine areas. We are not talking about the water column. That's an entirely separate set of rules in the convention. There happens to be the same measurement. The EEZ and the water column extend out 200 nautical miles from shore. But don't let that confuse the rest of the discussion. So we're talking about the seabed, subsoil, that extend beyond the territorial sea, which is typically 14 miles, throughout the natural prolongation, right? And these slides will be available, so you don't feel like you have to take frantic notes. Natural prolongation was an idea that was introduced as we tried to figure out how are we going to measure the shelf. So to the outer edge of the continental margin, whatever that means. So seabed, subsoil, natural prolongation to the outer edge of the continental margin, or, if you don't like that, simply go up 200 nautical miles from shore, and that's your continental shelf, right? So if you think back to that picture of how narrow the shelf is by Point Barrow and how broad it is off of Russia, any state, regardless of any coastal state, regardless of how narrow its shelf is automatically entitled to continental shelf rights up to 200 nautical miles. So we're not talking about that automatic entitlement. What we're talking about in the mapping process under Article 76, and why countries are out spending millions, if not billions, on this, is to see how far the physical features extend beyond 200 nautical miles. And for beyond 200 nautical miles, if you can show that you have valid science and your shelf goes that far, you can then also have the same continental shelf rights beyond 200 that you automatically have within 200. So I went from this world of black and white, words on a page, two-dimensional. Is that too dark?
Yeah.
It is too dark. Okay. This picture, though, just let me show it to you in the transition that I made going from working pretty much in a solitary legal understanding of parsing documents and thinking I knew what the continental shelf was to this. Right, all of a sudden I'm taken from this book world into the natural world of being out on an icebreaker for weeks, months at a time. And here we're sailing with the Canadian icebreaker, the Louis Ascendant, which carries seismic gear, and we carried bathymetric sonar instruments. Picture is courtesy of the Canadian Coast Guard helicopter. We only have one, well, we have two functioning icebreakers now, but we don't carry a helicopter with us, right? That all sorts of issues related to even just what our abilities are to operate up there. So being surrounded by this incredible physical environment and surrounded by scientists where every weeknight we had a science talk. And so really almost getting a private tutorial in the science behind how they understand the same language that I was looking at as a lawyer and understood as an international law expert. You enter into this type of colorful, three-dimensional, almost tactile, for me, appreciation of what the continental shelf is and where that outer edge of the continental margin, taking those words off the page, translating them into physically and visually perceptible images. And here we don't really even get to the outer edge of the continental margin, but this is, if you start up here, that's sort of the top of the shelf, if you will, at about 200 meters. And what we're looking for as we're out mapping is the point at which the continental rise comes down and meets the foot of the slope. And here you don't see it. The foot of the slope is where you have that flat abyssal plain where the sediments have filled up whatever's underneath it. And you can point to a discrete measuring point that is required by other language of the convention. It's also important to note about this picture that it was collected in ice-free waters, and it was collected over one summer. And so, of course, we have these beautiful images. But for a lot of what they're doing out there, you are often running into ice and not getting this complete a picture of what the shape of the shelf and slope and rise are. So we're mapping because of the rights set out in the convention. And here you say the Article 77 gives every coastal state exclusive rights to explore and exploit the resources of the shelf. And again, we're talking about what's on and attached to the seafloor, the subsoil, and what's underneath it. So primarily hydrocarbons, but we also just don't know yet what else might be there. And some examples are manganese nodules, sedentary species that move by attaching themselves to the floor. And what are those? What's the value of those? This is a map showing some of the areas in which we initially thought we might have continental shelf. And the figure that they listed back in 2001 for the value of those resources combined was $1.3 trillion worth of resources just off of the U.S. continental shelf alone. And I'll talk a little bit later about how some of these areas are no longer some that we're seriously considering. I should have said up front, I'm speaking obviously purely in my personal capacity, drawing on what I learned at the State Department, but I was there as a visiting scholar to the interagency task force that's working on this. So I was not a State Department employee, but rather an outside academic coming in and helping them think about the situation. And we can return to this map, but what you see, up in the yellow north of Barrow and off of the in the Bering Sea, those are two of the largest areas where we have the potential to say that's where the shelf extends beyond 200 nautical miles. All told, all of these yellow areas combined off of the Atlantic and the Gulf of Mexico, we're talking about, as the little announcement for the talk said, 2 more Californias at least. So it's a pretty good chunk of territory. And I should say there, it's not territory that we own. It's not like our own territory. It is rights to do something with the resources that are in that jurisdictional zone. And I think that's often a misstatement. People say, oh, well, we're expanding the size of the country. No, we're expanding our rights over resources in that area.
How does that chunk north of Barrow relate to the map you showed before that had quite a limited continental shelf? The polar image that you said we don't know everything, but I assume that we know kind of where the edge of the shelf is, but that looks like it's beyond the edge of the shelf as you described. It
is, and that helps emphasize the point that no matter how wide your shelf is, and if up to 200 nautical miles, which is roughly here, you automatically have rights to the resources, even if your shelf doesn't extend that far. Yeah.
Oh, okay, I didn't know.
And then it's beyond that you have to actually go through the exercise of producing the science and submitting it to the commission that I'll talk about in just a minute. But thanks for helping clarify that, because that's a question that I get every time. So this is just a reminder that it's not only happening in the Arctic, that countries around the world are doing this. The dark blue areas are ones that we know from a submission that's already been made to something called the Commission on the Limits of the Continental Shelf, which is a body of oceanographers and marine geophysicists established by the convention. And it's the scientists on this commission who look at the data that each country submits. So we only have 18 final recommendations from that committee out of some 60 or 70 submissions, but you can see one of the, up here off of Russia, this is a rough indication of where Russia would claim extended continental shelf rights. Or down here off of Australia, those are extended. The light blue is within 200, the dark blue is beyond 200, and the yellow is an interesting point I like to raise as well. Off of the coast of Somalia, we actually have a preliminary indication of how far they think their continental shelf goes. And think about it for a minute. Basically, a non-functioning state. How in the world did it have the resources to go and map? Because these are expensive undertakings. Well, the Norwegians, who are really leaders in this technology, and they're behind, if you know, the UNEP GRIDA, G-R-I-D-A, database, which is an excellent source of maps for Arctic and other parts of the world. They are a driving force and have a whole training program for developing country scientists to work with the scientists who have the ships, and they go out and help collect information. And the parties to the convention modified requirements so that states with fewer resources could at least put in a marker, if you will, before their deadline to submit data passed. And that marker is called a statement, a preliminary indication. So that's what the yellow areas are. this is a really simplified sketch of what I've been using my hands to show, but basically the difference between the continental shelf and the extended continental shelf. Again, automatic rights here, no matter the physical features, and then if you can show that it extends beyond, you can have extended continental shelf rights. Well,
Betsy, is there a difference between the term extended continental shelf and outer continental shelf?
Yes, and I'm not using them very precisely. So our national legislation, the Outer Continental Shelf Lands Act, refers to what the United States considers to be its outer continental shelf, basically everything right now up to 200 nautical miles beyond however broad the state waters are.
Okay.
And that varies state by state. Once we have published our information and assert the extent of our continental shelf, that outer continental shelf definition in that act will apply as well to the regions that we show are newly identified continental shelf rights. An extended continental shelf is a term that we sort of use in the, it's not in the convention, but it's one that's sort of shorthand that those of us who work on this talk about. I don't know if we have any geologists in the room, but maybe not, because you're all sitting comfortably. They get sort of itchy when they see the way the convention changed sort of the basic geology understanding of continental shelf, which is to have the shelf and the slope, so where it starts going down, and then the rise down to the abyssal plain as three distinct components, and that's what we consider, geologists consider, the continental margin, right? The lawyers take this and they call that whole thing, what would have been the flat shelf, the sloping slope, and the rise, that's all continental shelf as defined in the convention. Scientists, being a flexible group, they've gotten used to that, and within this context, when they say continental shelf, they mean the definition that's in the convention. And here you see the other zones, EEZ out to 200. High seas refers to the water column, not to the subfloor. And then the area is something that's defined by the convention as the common heritage of mankind. And that's basically any area that's beyond national jurisdiction. It's not the water column. It's simply the seafloor and the subsurface that is beyond any national jurisdiction, so beyond even the extended continental shelf. Yep.
And that's where I, only know very little about this. So the state, I know I hear the Alaska complaining about the difference between our state's jurisdiction versus Louisiana. How is that set, and how does that relate to kind of these? If it's, I don't know if that's an easy question that fits here or not.
I can give a short answer, which is that in Alaska, the state waters are 3 miles. In some other states, by dint of litigation and sort of judicial history, they're broader, but most states' waters are 3 nautical miles wide. And there's a complicated, and others in the room can probably speak to the Alaska-specific debate about that, but right now it's agreed. Mara?
Just had a quick question. So the ocean, the water is not considered a commons, but just the
That's right. Only the mineral resources and living resources of the floor. Because you have high seas freedoms of fishing in those waters beyond national jurisdiction.
Okay, which is subject to a regulatory regime all of its own.
It's subject only to the convention and to customary international law as to what those high seas freedoms are. And fishing is a high seas freedom. Okay. Laying of cables is a high seas freedom, right? So China could come and fish in the high Arctic just by virtue of it being an area beyond any national jurisdiction, which is one of the reasons there are negotiations currently underway for a high Arctic fisheries agreement that would pull in non-Arctic countries to agree to the proposed purpose of that agreement is to just kind of like the North Pacific closure of the Arctic fishery. Let's hold off till we know more. When we know more, then we can work on how the fishery might look. Yeah, Scott?
Does that apply to oil and gas as well?
No, the high Arctic agreement right now is a negotiation only on fisheries. And
so if the Chinese wanted to drill
They would have to get the permission of the coastal state that has the extended continental shelf rights beyond 200, and I'll show a map in just a second that shows how small the area is that would have no Arctic coastal jurisdiction, right? In theory, they could, they would have to go to the International Seabed Authority, which is another body established under the convention. So it's covered, if you will, but there hasn't been oil and gas development yet under it. They're working more.
Presumably they would have some right.
Yes, but they would have to work within the framework of the Seabed Authority. Yeah. Yeah, it's a beautifully complicated situation. So to Scott's question, these two white areas, let's say China does want to go drill there, they wouldn't go to Canada, they wouldn't go to Alaska, or excuse me, they wouldn't go to the United States. They would go to the Seabed Authority, basically. But here, this also helps distinguish. So the blue area, including the white holes, if we're talking about the water column, those are high seas. Vietnam, Nicaragua, Malawi, anybody that has a vessel can send it up there and they enjoy the high seas freedoms. But when we're talking about the seafloor, this is a Canadian geophysicist's estimation on how much of it will be left outside of a national extended continental shelf. So not much. And this raises additional concerns, certainly with my science colleagues. I'm working mostly with UAF marine geophysicists, but one of their big concerns is that Russia, it's already hard enough to get data in and out, or equipment in and data out. And once they have extended continental shelf, what's that going to mean for data collection? So another outcome of the Karuna of the Arctic Council Ministerial in 2013 was discussions on an arrangement to talk about research cooperation. So those are just now beginning in part to address those kinds of questions.
Just so I understand, you're saying the darker blue area is area beyond 200 miles,
That's correct.
Which is either part of the shelf, the slope, or the rise.
That's correct. Yeah, that is, as defined under Article 76, continental shelf, and as we say colloquially, extended continental shelf.
Well, and maybe you'll come to this. If you want to attribute parts of both the light blue and the dark blue area to countries, how do you draw the boundary between, say, the USA and Russia, or Russia and Norway?
That's an excellent question. I'm not going to come to that, only in passing, because that's an entirely separate exercise. So but it's also governed by the Law of the Sea Convention. So when we're talking about how far out Canada's shelf extends, or how far out the U.S. shelf extends, that's under Article 76 and related provisions. And in Article 76, which only talks about the extent of the shelf, it says, the Commission has no role in settling boundaries as between countries, maritime boundaries. That would happen and is happening. We are currently in active negotiations with the Canadians to resolve the Beaufort Sea boundary. And I will talk a bit about how that's already played out in Norway and Russia with their Barents Sea agreement. But the basic distinction is that for how far out it goes, that's for the Scientific Commission. For as borders between countries, that is a diplomatic exercise that hopefully ends peacefully. If not, it might go to, well, it's still peaceful, but go to a dispute settlement mechanism. Any other questions so far on this map or otherwise?
Just to clarify, that's prospective, though, correct?
That's right. This is Ron McNabb's idea of based on submissions we've already seen. And others have come up with slightly different pictures, but more or less the same idea. Yes?
What's an exclusive sovereign right?
So that's, let's say, Rosneft comes to, or Statoil comes to the United States and says, we want to drill on your extended continental shelf. Only the United States can say, yes, you can, or no, you can't. And you have to do it according to the regulations that we have in place. So it's basically a say over who gets to access your shelf.
Is it based on the United Nations definition of a nation state? Exclusive sovereign right?
To the extent that the convention codifies other conventions and their definitions, yes, but it really is almost a self-contained definition within the convention itself. There are references to different kinds of sovereign rights, and they basically diminish. You have greater sovereign rights, obviously, on your own territory, and greater sovereign rights in your territorial sea. They diminish greatly in the EEZ, which is not national waters. Those are international waters over which a nation has some say. So basically, those sovereign rights diminish the farther you go from shore. Does that answer your question? There's not a definition of sovereignty, so it's how the international system thinks about sovereignty. But exclusive means the coastal state gets to say who acts on in that area.
Because they're a signatory to a treaty?
Yes, and we will get to the fact that the United States is not yet a party to the convention and may never be, but considers itself bound by these provisions as being bound by customary international law.
Yeah, I'm just, for sake of conversation, I'm confused about what the definition of a sovereign reference is. I'll look it up.
Okay, well, what you'll find in the convention is reference to sovereign rights, and they don't define sovereign, but each reference to sovereign talks about what those rights are. So as the sovereign rights to explore and exploit, that's all it says, but it means that's up to the coastal state. It has the say.
That's assumed.
Yeah.
It's implied or assumed.
Yeah. Diane.
So I'm just curious about looking at the common heritage area,
Mm-hmm.
whether your sense is that could it grow, or is the likelihood only that it would shrink?
It could be a little bigger.
Mm-hmm.
It will depend on basically what the commission does next with Russia's submission, which is resubmitting, but won't look a whole lot different. Yes?
I just had one last question. So the white areas are exploitable continental shelf, not abyssal plain, because the abyssal plain is always open.
They are the area, basically. So it's subject not to any national jurisdiction, and we're talking only about the seafloor. You can think of it as abyssal plain. Yes, it's ocean floor and its resources that no country has exclusive sovereign rights over, but that the International Seabed Authority would say this is what you would do to exploit resources on that area.
And that's the white area?
Yeah.
It's, okay.
Mm-hmm. Anything else? And this slide always generates a lot of questions.
Just
discussion.
Some other questions that have been asked. Is there any discussion about responsibilities alongside of rights, or is it really just focused on rights?
Responsibility for
maintaining any sort of like environmental health of the seabed floor, or maintaining health of like the water column above, or access to the water column. Or, I mean, I know the water column itself isn't governed, but certainly there's got to be some sort of impact,
right,
on it.
There's nothing specific in the section that talks about the continental shelf. And to your question again, what does it mean to have the sovereign right to explore and exploit, right? It doesn't say and conserve, but that's how the United States interprets that particular provision. And it does so based on another part of the convention, which was new in thinking about the rules for the law of the sea. And that's an entire section devoted to environmental protection. And there it talks about the rights to use the resources, but always in the context of the rights of other states. You're the coastal state, you have certain rights, but non-coastal states also have rights. Those are non-sovereign rights. Right? So it's by pulling together the different parts of the convention that you could come up with that interpretation. Okay, so here I find that if I stick to script, I make it clearer. So I am going to So I could go on for 2 hours on this slide and be grateful that I won't. How you do define it, and this is all set out in the convention. Short version is this. If you're representing a coastal state that wants to show it has continental shelf beyond 200 nautical miles, you take 2 steps. First, you need to find the foot of the slope, right? Which generally speaking is the point where the base of the slope has a maximum change in gradient. Right, that is sort of the steepest drop-off point before you get to that abyssal plain. Then from the foot of the slope, the shelf extends either just 60 nautical miles out, or, and this is my favorite, it goes out to a distance that is 1%, where the sediment is, the thickness is 1% of the distance back to the foot of the slope. It took me about 3 years to fully comprehend that, and I'm not sure I do still, but who came up with that? There were geophysicists on the negotiating teams, and the Gardner formula, which is the sediment thickness formula, was from an Irish geophysicist. And this, of course, gave a maximum extent to Ireland. Yeah. And the United States has the advantage of being both a narrow shelf state and a broad shelf state, because we have the Atlantic and the Pacific, where you have a very different feature on either side. So those are the 2 how far out you can go formulas, and you can use any combination, so basically whatever gets you the most. But you can't go too far. There are cutoff lines as well. So once you've picked your points to show how far out the foot of the slope gets you, then the cutoff or constraint lines, one is simply, again, rather straightforward, 350 nautical miles from there. Or the other is where it's 2,500 meters deep plus 100 nautical miles. And again, geophysicists and lawyers and other diplomats worked on this.
So is it whichever is greatest of those or whichever is smallest of those?
Greatest. That's how it's been interpreted. There isn't any real clear guideline, but what we've seen from the 18 sets of recommendations so far from this commission of scientists is that they're allowing states to combine these, both the foot of the slope lines and the constraint lines for a maximum claim.
And that's consistent with how they did the 200 miles anyway.
Right. And it does get to the question about what rules are going to apply there. So some people cringe when they see that map and go, oh my gosh, there's going to be no, it's all national control. Others look at that map and say, thank God, there's national control from Canada and the United States because they can apply their environmental requirements. Right? So it's a mixed bag. It really is. So briefly, and just to leave time for, well, not too briefly, but maybe 5-6 more minutes. So this is the process for these submissions. The convention establishes, as I've said, that commission of scientists. Not a single lawyer on it. It's all scientists, and they basically are just looking at your data and how you present it and saying, yes, this is credible. No, it's not. Or, we really don't agree with you, Japan, and this is a recommendation that's come out, as to how you say the continental shelf relates to this trench, right? And so they might readjust a few points. And then Japan can either take it or leave it. Most of them are taking it because of this statement that the CLCS recommendations, and their only recommendations, are final and binding, not the recommendations themselves, but if if Japan says, yes, we agree with those recommendations, we're now going to publish in our national legislation the points that show the extent of our shelf, just like we have an EEZ published in our U.S. Laws, and we're going to base it on those recommendations. Then it's final and binding. One of the many legal questions that arises from Article 76 process is what in the heck does that mean? What's final and binding? Is there a chance for appeal? We don't know, because it just hasn't gone that far yet. You have 10 years from becoming party, which is why it was significant. I mentioned earlier that some of the developing states were allowed more time to submit or to at least put in a preliminary indication before their 10 years ran. Canada's 10 years runs next month, and we would sit at the table with our Canadian colleagues and exchange information and approaches, and all of the scientists from around the Arctic get together once a year and exchange what they've learned as they've been out mapping. And usually their foreign ministry representatives are at that meeting as well. So it's a pretty open process to a certain extent.
But as you pointed out, this is more than the RDQ.
That's correct. We have 67 submissions so far and only 18 sets of recommendations. The parties to the convention, and I say that because it's not the United Nations, it's the parties to the convention that say, you know, we do need to change the rules so that the developing states can at least get some basic information in.
How does it work? I'm interested in this as scientists only. So let's say, and this is a simplified question, but let's say we send our U.S. scientific team out, and we say, go along and figure out where this is. And let's say what do you know, they're split. There's 5 of them that say, we think it's out here, farther out, and there are 5 of them that think it's...
That happens. That's what my job was at state. Was
in here. Then do they just kind of work it out for themselves as scientists, or does somebody in the State Department come in and say, of course we're going to go with the 5 of you that think it's farther out?
Or not, right? Because there might well be situations where a country says, you know, scientifically, yeah, it's there, but diplomatically, do we want to make that assertion?
Okay, so back to my question: do the scientists really just think? Are you saying we really just leave it up to scientists to say, here's where we draw that outer line, or do we in some way inject our foreign policy and lawyers and diplomats into saying, here's the United States submission on this line?
Yeah. So I think that's a great question, because it allows us to think about how science and law interact at 2 different stages. One is when internally in any country, whether it's the United States or Canada, the 2 I know best, it's always a team of scientists and lawyers working together. So both factors come into play. And it depends on the country and on the personalities around the table, right, as to what gets into that final agreement that then goes to the second place where science and law interface, and that's at the commission. And at the commission, it's purely scientists saying, this is what, you know, after you, let's take Australia as an example. They were one of the early states to submit. And they made, some say, the mistake of having the lawyers drive the process, right? The lawyers showing up and making it into this very legal, technical argument, and these scientists on the commission are, you know, they don't want to hear that. They want to hear the science, right? So that was a judgment that the ministry made, the foreign ministry and ministry of the environment, that they wanted their lawyers to argue the science. Other countries are having scientists present to that commission. That's a long response. I hope it is somewhat directed to your question.
It is somewhat directed to my
Yeah.
question.
I can't obviously answer it specifically for the United States, but rest assured that it's not just the diplomats saying, that's not going to fly, we're not going to do it.
But it's also not scientists, it's not just a bunch of scientists being delegated with go out and draw where the line is. That's right,
right. And I'll talk a little bit about that with some specific examples. Yes?
Just quickly. So hypothetically, do you think there would ever be a situation in which, like, internal to a country, scientists and lawyers work together and decided not to claim the full extent that they could?
Right.
Then they present that to the scientists at INCOS, and then would they ever say, like, down that proposition based on the fact that they're not actually claiming?
The commission would say shoot it down? Or?
The scientists, so the solely scientist-based.
No, they're showing considerable deference to what it is that the state decides to submit. And in some instances it actually said, you know, you could actually claim a little more. And states have then changed accordingly. But as an example, so at this conference that a bunch of us were at in Iceland, Vasilyev, who's the senior Arctic official for Russia, said very clearly, well, in code, we're not going to go as far as you think we are, right? That it's going to be a neighborly, what we're presenting, don't worry. We're not going to create a problem, right? So, and in some cases, some believe they could go halfway across the Luminosa, right? But it sounds like, and that's the beauty of these meetings where the science teams get together and exchange their latest discoveries with the diplomat type sort of sitting in the background. It's an open scientific discussion, but always aware that eventually it's not a document of science that we're producing, it's an advocacy document that is based heavily on science. Yeah, Diane.
So if they're not claiming areas that we think they could claim, then does that automatically go into that white area by the map, or is it, I'm thinking about, obviously US and Canada have, depending on what angle you go, right, you're arguing. So if Canada said we're not claiming that, then US would just jump on it and say,
not necessarily. And that again is subject to internal collaborative discussions.
So it could be expanding then that other.
It could expand the area, yeah. And who knows? I mean, the two countries might agree that it's in their interest to have greater area. Most countries have not taken that approach so far. So just to give you some of the, this is not the gee-whiz stuff. It's a 14-member agency. The state chairs this, or task force, and state chairs it, and NOAA and Department of Interior through USGS are the sub-chairs on it. And USGS has just been terrific, and it's basically heading up the seismic data collection, and NOAA has headed up, along with Larry Mayer at the Center for Coastal and Ocean Mapping at UNH, have headed up the bathymetric collection. It's been around since 2007. Although in 2001 is when Congress first directed that we even do a desktop study to figure out what, and that's what that first map was, sort of this is where we think we might have extended continental shelf. Interesting story I won't go into now about an earmark that got that center to be in New Hampshire. Because our senator was reading the treaty one day and goes, oh my God, this is a major scientific undertaking. And even if we're not party now, we're going to have to get going on it. So that's why Larry Mayer and the University of New Hampshire Center for Coastal and Ocean Mapping is in New Hampshire. And Larry is just a fantastic mentor and colleague. And most of the images here that have the UNH logo are from him, and I had the great privilege of standing midnight watch with him and just learning so much about how they view this whole process in the treaty. We've been surveying for about 10 years. We're now pretty much done with the bathymetric surveys, a little bit of seismic left, and now we're shifting from data collection to actually documenting it. And that's why they pulled me in. And I like to joke, because it's a great joke and it's true. I know I shouldn't say that about my own jokes, but there are about 4 people in the country who could do what I did at State, and I'm the only one who finds it interesting, right? Because it's so totally obscure. You take the knowledge of the convention, you've learned about the techniques and science behind it, and then you start writing, again, not a science document, but a document of advocacy that is primarily science-based. This is just a summary. We've had 27 bathymetric cruises, over 2 million square miles, seismic data, 14,000 linear kilometers. I thought I had something in here about how, okay, this compares it to other features we know. So the Arctic has been a real focus, and 4 of our 8 cruises have been jointly with Canada. And we've mapped the size of Montana out there in the Arctic Ocean, much of it over the Canada Basin, which is really boring. It's just this flat bathtub full of sediment. Seismic, roughly Los Angeles to New York City 3.5 times. That's the length of our seismic lines. These are not industry strength seismic. This is basically tricycle seismic. It gives you a basic idea of what's out there. So this is one of Larry's fantastic slides. Back there at the Barrow margin, you see that same image I showed earlier, collected in ice-free water. Every time they leave Barrow, and this is Healy that has a 200-meter or a 200 array. It's basically as wide as the ship, its sonar array. So you take a different course every time to get new information. And you're looking for that foot of the slope point, right? Where does it come down and meet the abyssal plain? And in 2001, they thought it was there, based both on the bathymetric, which are these bright colored swaths, and on the seismic, which is sort of like a mini sonogram, right? It shows you what's under that sediment. That's the bathtub, and this is what's really under it. but it's not the classic down to the abyssal plain, right? There's still sort of uplapping sediments. That was 2007, the first really low summer for ice, and they decided they would go out another 300 miles, and they found that. And there you can see that classic drop-off, and the structure under the sediment is where the foot of the slope is, right, where the rise meets the abyssal plain. So that adds potentially, or clearly, I mean, the science is clear on it, quite a bit of extended continental shelf. And here you're standing, I should have said at the outset, at the North Pole, looking back at the Chukchi Cap, and there's Barrow. So that's the kind of information we're able to find. This is another sort of a flip. There's Chukchi, there's the tracks. Gives you a sense of how little is covered. We discovered a new seamount somewhere around there where all the extra swaths are, right? And we know there are others out there, we just didn't cross them. And you also need samples from the seafloor, because sometimes you need to go beyond showing the shape and you need to show what is the actual, what are the rocks out there. And this involves sending a dredge down a mile, basically, and bringing it back up. It's and picking the right place to dredge, right? Just fascinating science. And sometimes, like this one, having a really successful, look at the size of those rocks, right? So that was a major success. Okay, this, you don't really, these are all the different kinds of science information. Baseline data, process bathy, seismic, texts, photos. It's all in a database at the National Geophysical Data Center at Boulder, at NOAA's facility out there. And so we did several of our workshops out there. Just the sheer logistics of how do you get all this information in the same place and be able to automate a lot of the process, because we're going to have thousands, tens of thousands of foot of the slope points, right? So I won't go into that detail. I do really want to show you, not so much this is Australia's submission, right? We're going to, it's how many volumes? 20 volumes, and this is multiple copies down here, right? And now we're gearing more toward purely electronic. But beyond all of that data compiled in these volumes, above all, you want it to be a really compelling narrative. And I know it's my own obscure fascination with this, but you read some of them, the pharaohs, theirs is just beautiful. It's so fun to read. You're immersed in their underwater world, and you get how it relates to their national identity. And some are just dry as sawdust. So, briefly, we chose the Gulf of Mexico as our pilot region because it's such a slam dunk on the geology. Boom, that rise goes down and hits the floor. And even with a clear-cut story, it's just figuring out all of the moving pieces and creating a submission. I was there 10 months, and that was just sort of the start of it. We do have a joint hydrocarbon development agreement. The House has signed off on it with Mexico. We also have a fully functional agreed maritime boundary and continental shelf boundary. And that was a precursor. It was because we're working toward resolving the Article 76 issues, right? And this is happening around the globe. Norway and Russia had a dispute for 40 years as to their maritime boundary and their continental shelf boundary, and they resolved it. They also have a joint hydrocarbon development agreement that includes joint fisheries management arrangements as well. So while they're separate, you can see these processes driving each other, and it's really quite exciting. And in an instance, in my view, where international law is actually working in creating greater stability and certainty. This is the gee whiz stuff. I know I have 5 minutes, but these are all mostly Larry's slides from NOAA and UNH. So from about 2000 BC until 1930, we just dropped a lead line to figure out what's the shape of the floor, how deep is it down there. And then we didn't use a lead line, we used a beam of sound, single beam. And so you would go back and forth tracing individual beam, but that's not very wide. And then we switched to what Healy has, what all modern mapping vessels have, which is a multi-beam. And as I said, Healy's is as wide as the ship. It's about 200. It is 200 beams. And that was not until the mid-1980s that this technology became prevalent. So what difference did it make? Here's an area you know. So Gulf of Alaska, there, obviously, we could do it in ice-free waters. I wasn't on these cruises. What we knew before the bathymetric mapping with the multi-beam was this. This is a combination of many, many different data sources, fishing vessels, recreational vessels, declassed military, and that's what we knew about the shape of the bathymetry of the Gulf of Alaska. After mapping it with multi-beam, that's what we know. And it's fascinating not only for the Article 76 purposes, but even more so for trying to begin to get understanding of ecosystem relationships between land and sea and underwater benthic habitats. What are these canyons, right? So that's the kind of information that we're able to produce in addition to the Article 76 results. Discovering new seamounts off the Marianas. We're out mapping by the Mariana Trench, the Palmyra Atoll. We're finding gas hydrates in the Arctic, lots of them, as I've already talked about, collecting dredge samples. A methane plume off of California. This methane plume is 1,400 meters high. That's in the water column. And this is the same technology that Larry then took to the Gulf of Mexico when he was asked to go map the Deepwater Horizon plume and where it was going. So we're learning all sorts of things about the capabilities of this multi-beam. We're discovering scours. This is one that shows probably what was caused by an ice sheet scraping on the seafloor. This is at about 1,300 feet below the ocean surface. These are pockmarks that go down into the surface. Again, approximately 1,600 feet, a clear sign of some sort of hydrocarbon escaping natural gas or methane hydrate. So just to wrap, what I've learned as a lawyer from working with the scientists, Larry's motto for the Center for Coastal and Ocean Mapping is map once and use many times. So even though we're doing this for Article 76 purposes, and their website is terrific. Just Google CCOM in New Hampshire and you'll find it. And it shows all of the different uses, and also there are many different projects. Law of the Sea is just one of the few things that they do. This is a good law, as complicated as it is, and not being specific about sovereign rights and confusing the geologist's definition of the shelf with the Article 76. It still has produced basically a good, stable outcome. I've already talked about the fact that boundaries are being resolved. And I've got to say, watching this group of Arctic 8 or Arctic 5 scientists work together, they themselves are really a diplomatic force. They wanted to work together to create that map up front. They still work together to share information, and they are contributing to the very peaceful resolution of these issues around the globe. So I'm sorry, we had time for questions, and those of you who need to go, but I'm happy to stick around and answer a few more questions. So thank you.
Turn your lights back on.
Yes.
What's the budget for this process?
So far we've spent about $40 million, and almost all of that has been the costs of renting Healy, covering the science costs. And every year or every appropriation cycle, we go to Congress and ask for, the State Department goes to Congress and asks for new funding. Not much.
And it's split up among the 12 agencies?
It's split up, and it's given to the task force. And so the USGS, Debbie Hutchinson has been our lead scientist for the Seismic, so she gets some for her cruises. Larry applies for NSF grants in addition to supplement the 40 million, right? So it's a fairly, given the trillions of potential resource dollars out there, it's a pretty low investment right now. And they will be upping that as the process moves ahead.
What difference does it make if the United States never formally ratifies the law?
The difference is that you have less legal certainty. So it's highly unlikely that Exxon would come and say, yeah, we're going to invest, or take Shell, right? And we're going to keep spending money in that area beyond 200, where, yeah, you, the U.S., say this is where it is, and you followed all these processes, but it's not as sure as in the Canadian Beaufort, where they have gone to the commission and gotten that imprimatur of the commission. It's better legal title if we become party. If we don't, what we will do is, and are already doing, make all of our data public, and that's not a requirement of the convention. All we really get is this executive summary. And just make as transparent as possible how we've gone about saying that this is where we believe the line should be drawn, showing the extent of our continental shelf. We'll publish legislation, and we will make all of that science available. But it's not quite the same as having that standard.
I guess what happens if another country claims something as part of ours, and they go to the convention and they get, we don't really have standing to rebut it.
We certainly have mechanisms to contest it, and those might include, we can't unless the other party pulls us into the International Tribunal, right? So we don't have access to any of those dispute mechanisms, dispute resolution mechanisms.
We don't have any scientists on that panel.
We don't have any scientists on that panel. We don't have any judges on the International Tribunal for the Law of the Sea. We don't have anybody helping shape the rules at the International Seabed Authority for all of the activity that is going. They are granting leases in the area right now. So yeah, we're cut out from those as well.
So presumably it means that if somebody really thinks the United States should join this thing, they should not go with some international company to try to start doing something in part of the area that the United States doesn't have. And say, oh, we have the right to do this.
No, that is not likely to happen given what it would cost that company to do. It's sort of a flip or a tangential result. Some in the environmental community say, terrific, let's not resolve it, right? Because there will not be activity until we do.
So I guess maybe that's another way of saying that it doesn't really matter right now because the Arctic, the part of the Arctic that's potentially in play is not that valuable at the present time.
Right.
But if it becomes so because of less sea ice and technological change, markets, etc., then it might be the stakes for the United States might be a lot higher.
Yeah. You also raised something I should have mentioned is that most of you probably know, a lot of you know this, that most of the oil and gas is considered to be within the 200. So we're not quite sure what it is, what the resource values will be beyond 200.
I might have missed it, but did you talk about why the U.S. won't ratify it?
No.
Or outside of just the U.S.'s,
it's come out of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee 3 times. And each time, basically, procedural rules have kept it, or maneuvering have kept it from getting to the floor.
Majority of the Senate 60 votes.
From time to time I read, the Russians are making outrageous claims that would allow them to get this sort of major resource grab, and that's why this is important. Is there any what if any is the foundation of that rumor, and to what extent does it relate to the process you're talking about as opposed to something different?
It's mostly media hype and inaccurate, and that's one slide I didn't include, is that there isn't a conflict in the Arctic, right? That it is, I suppose I could do this a little more efficiently, sorry. I'll go back to that map to show, but basically their first submission to the commission, showed potentially going quite far out on the Lomonosov Ridge. And the commission said, plausible, but you don't give us enough science. So they've been collecting more information since then, and will come back with more science.
So you're saying what's actually going on is they're following the rules?
They're totally following the rules. And the Russians show up and share data at these science gatherings, just like the Norwegians and the Danes.
To what extent is what I'm hearing, should it be translated as some people are not happy about the way these rules, this science, is playing out and the result that it gives?
That would be one reading. I think more often it's just inaccurate reporting and liking a good headline. Right? It is a race in the sense each country has this 10-year limit. And there are the potential for the kinds of things you spoke about. Well, there will be overlaps in some of the claims. That's not for the commission to decide. Let's say they say to, yes, Canada and Denmark for Greenland, we accept your limits of the shelf, and those happen to overlap. It wouldn't be for the commission to resolve that. It would be for Canada and Greenland to resolve that. And that's not, it's not going to happen. It just because of the good diplomatic relationships between those countries. And even the indication from Vasilyev, right, that we'll see. I may be proven wrong, but it's even if there are overlaps, we're not going to go to war over it. We're going to sit down with our diplomats and resolve what eventually the maritime boundary will be. Yes?
So can the U.S. submit an application without being signatory?
Nope. That is very clear.
Okay, so all the research that you're describing is just being compiled into a potential application?
Well,
I mean, why are we doing all this research?
Because if we never become party, we still will, as I say, publish legislation that shows where we believe the extent of our shelf to be, and we will make all of that science as transparently available as possible. People already, if you go to Larry's site, you can access the data, and you can tweak it yourselves to see if you disagree with where we say the foot of the soil points are. So
still we want to document it even though we're not
yes.
going through the international.
Yeah, because we can't just say, well, that's where the extent of the shelf is because we think so. Especially because in effect, that's what a lot of the countries are doing. They give very minimal information in these executive summaries. So you just have to trust the commission and trust the science.
And are the scientific efforts as to great an extent as you described in the Arctic and the other parts of the U.S., like in the West Coast and the East Coast? So it's going on all across the country.
Along the Atlantic seaboard, we're wrapping up bathymetry. Pretty much done. We're 80 to 90% done with the data collection. So it really is just a few more cruises.
Really?
Yeah. Been doing it for 10 years.
Okay.
Can you go to your very final slide, the ending one?
Sorry, I know there's a better way to do this. I'm just
want to check. So you're saying that was the one I wanted?
Yeah.
No, the one with the picture.
Oh.
So at the very end, you say the final step is you go and you draw the line in the ocean? Sorry. Anyway, thank you very much for
your questions.
this is really fascinating, and we greatly appreciate it.
Yeah, my pleasure.